there's a dot on my head. So most people who have a gaming table set up at home usually have something like this. It is cheap and it does get the job done, but it's not really very nice looking. It's not really the kind of thing that I would want to have sitting out in my living room all the time. And the other thing is it's quite low to the ground. I went to a tournament recently and played 8 games on that kind of trestle table setup, and by the end of it my back was really hurting just from leaning over the table for 3 hours at a time. So I wanted to have something that would be a little bit more flexible and presentable compared to that cheaper option. Now I've been using a standing desk for work for probably the last couple of years. I mostly just use it to raise my desk up to a height that is more comfortable because I'm a little bit taller, but I have recently also been using it to actually stand up. In fact, this desk here is my main standing desk, and it's quite nice to be able to raise it up and down to suit what I'm doing at the time. So I had a look around on Amazon and found a desk frame, so without the tabletop, that was pretty cheap, and I thought I could get some stuff from Bunnings, the hardware store, and have a go at making my own desk. I did do year 8 woodworking, so I'm sure I could recollect some of the skills to create something, along with watching some things on YouTube, to get something that looks a lot nicer than the old trestle table, that is flexible and functional. So I just wanted to see if I could challenge myself to make something that's maybe not the greatest thing in the world, but is a lot better than my current setup. So I had my first requirement in that the table had to be one that can raise up and down, and I also had to think about the size, and initially I just wanted to make a table that's big enough to play smaller size games, so Combat Patrol, Killteam, and board games and things like that, because I don't have a huge amount of space in my living room, but I wanted to have the table permanently there, and I figured later on down the track I can figure out some way to extend the table to play larger 1,000 point, 2,000 point games if I wanted to. So those are my main 2 requirements, is to have a desk that I can adjust the height of, and to have it at least the right size to play up to a Combat Patrol game. So I went to Bunnings and had a look at some of the panels that they have, these pre-made utility panels, because they're pretty cheap, and I found ones that roughly matched the Combat Patrol size. So I had to actually buy 2 of them because Combat Patrol is about 800mm wide and the max width they had was 600. So if I attach 2 together like this, I can fit the Combat Patrol size board fine. So I decided to just glue the 2 pieces together. I had to think about different options of whether to use a dowel or use a pocket hole jig or something like that, but I think I was just over engineering it for what it was really going to be, because it's going to have a frame that's going to hold these 2 pieces together. So glue is going to be fine. If you use wood glue and you get a good bond between the 2 pieces, it's pretty strong. So just applied glue to one side, and then you can just use your finger to make sure it's spread out evenly, and then I can just attach the 2 sides together. And I had some long clamps to clamp the 2 pieces together. You don't really need to do this. You can just butt them up against 2 kind of square surfaces, some bookcases or something like that, to hold them together, but I just decided to have these 2 clamps together to get the maximum bond. So you just want to leave that for about 24 hours to make sure that the glue hardens properly, and just wipe away some of the glue that squeezes out between the 2 sides just with a wet cloth. So next I'm going to sand the surface to get rid of some of the dried on glue, but also these panels, they weren't exactly flush, so I just used a rough sander to try and smooth out the join between the two. Then I followed that up with some fine sandpaper to just give the whole thing a once over, because we need to prepare the surface for the next step, which is a stain and varnish. So make sure you get all the sawdust off. And I chose to use a water-based stain just because it's a bit more forgiving, and I didn't want to get oil-based stain and fumes everywhere in the living room, which is where I was doing this. It also does get quite messy, so make sure you're wearing an apron and some gloves, and you've got a drop sheet all around the area where you're going to be painting, because the stain will flick out further than you think, and you don't want to get that on any of your furniture or the floors or the walls. So the actual process of applying the stain only takes about 5 minutes, but then you've got to let it dry for about 2 hours. So you want to make sure that you're doing this somewhere where you can leave it, and preferably somewhere indoors or somewhere where there's not a lot of dust, because you don't want dust to settle into the stain. And between coats you want to lightly sand just to make sure it smooths out between, because it does get a bit rough depending on how watered down the stain is. I didn't water it down at all, so I needed to do a bit of sanding in between each coat. The other thing is you want to try and make it as smooth as possible, and make sure you don't get any really deep pooling. Same like if you were applying a contrast paint to a miniature. So you just want to make sure it's smooth, especially the edges. I had to go back and sand back some of the edges a few times because there were some really deep drips that I accidentally left. So yeah, you want to apply at least 3 coats. I chose 3 coats because I didn't want to take forever, and letting that 2 hours to dry between each coat, and that will give you a really good color, a solid color, and it'll also protect the wood, because this is a stain and a varnish, so it can withstand some of the bumps and things that you'll get while you're playing and moving things around on top of it. So this is the 3rd coat, and yeah, it looks pretty nice and shiny and smooth and a good color. So while I was doing the staining and varnishing of the tabletop, the frame with the legs came in from Amazon, and the first thing I noticed was that they were on these feet and it wasn't very mobile. So I decided to go back to Bunnings again and have a look at some wheels or casters. So I chose these ones with a little lock so I can secure it. And yeah, I'm just going to get rid of those feet and replace them with these casters. This will let me move the table around if I'm cleaning, or just to move it out of the way if I need a bit more space in the living room. So I think this is a far better option for this table than just the flat feet. So then I just assemble the rest of the table per instructions. It's pretty easy. And I just pick one of the sides of the tabletop which looks nicer and put that on one side, and then I'm just going to attach the tabletop with some screws that all come in the kit. So yeah, you get everything you need, and you get this little controller, and I'm going to drill that onto the side, and here's what the tabletop looks like. It raises up nicely, and look, that is my table done to the original requirements. It raises up and it's big enough to play up to a Combat Patrol sized game. So this is the Combat Patrol mat and the terrain, but there are some problems. It's pretty easy to knock things off, and it's pretty easy to have dice go flying off the edge. So I think the next enhancement I'm going to make is to put a border on it. So it's about 4 centimeters on 3 sides of the board. The 4th side I'm going to do something a little bit different, but I went back to Bunnings again and got some 30mm planks here. I just wanted to leave a little bit of a gap between the edges and the mat, and then I'm just sanding and cutting them to size, and then applying the stain and varnish exactly the same as I did with the tabletop. Use the same stain and the same number of coats so it all looks coherent. Now, to attach these to the tabletop, I thought of doing it a few different ways. Originally, I wanted them to be completely removable, but I just thought I'd just glue them down. So I'm going to use the glue and screw method because they're not quite straight, these planks. They're just cheap wood, so I need to apply a little bit more of a fix to these than just using the glue. So just carefully line everything up. Then I want to use clamps to securely clamp it down to give the glue the best chance to dry. Just wipe away the excess glue that squeezes out when you apply those clamps. And then I turn it upside down and I just countersink a little hole in, and then I put in a wood screw to just make sure it's completely firm. Now for the fourth table edge, unfortunately I recorded a very poor angle with my shoulder in the way, but I decided not to glue this and instead use some furniture bolts to attach it so it could be easily removed. So if I want to extend it and add in a second table to butt up against it, I can do that. So after that, the second iteration of the table is done and it's looking quite nice with that raised edge to keep the dice on track. But I thought I could now add a shelf. So I found these shelves once again at Bunnings. They're designed to go on a wall, but I'm actually going to hang them upside down underneath the tabletop. So I got another piece of wood and I figure I can get two of these shelves to hang. But in order to do that, I need to cut some holes to make an allowance for the legs. So I'm going to just use my jigsaw to cut those. You can use a hand saw if you don't have a jigsaw. So I'm just going to cut these three little grooves in there so the leg will fit there and gravity will keep the shelf in place. So I varnish the shelf and then I'm going to attach it. Now, because of the legs that are already there, I couldn't really get it exactly in the middle without having to take the raising mechanism off and sort of slotting in the legs in between the middle crossbar and where that mechanism is. So just want to make sure that the shelf will go on without having to get too close to the motor and all the bits. Then I just screw them on like that and make sure it just sits nice and flush. So while I was on the subject of shelves, one last thing I wanted to do with this table is add a sideboard. So I had another piece of wood, the same as the others, and I was trying to figure out how best to attach it. So I ended up going for these little brackets. It's probably not the best way, but it was the quickest and easiest way I had. They only came in silver, so I sprayed them black. They're sort of galvanized steel, so I had to put lots of layers of paint on to actually not have it rub off immediately. It's probably not going to last too long. And I figured the easiest or best way to attach these is just to use a long flathead screw. So drill a really big guide hole in there and then use these, I think they're 70 mil screws to just drill that in so it gets fairly flush to the bracket so it doesn't stick out too much and I get enough purchase on the side. So then I just attach that onto the raised edge and clamp it down. It's not too strong, but it will hold my little accessories on it. So one final test run and just making sure that it will raise up and down with all the extra shelvings on it. Does a good job of that. And it will fit the mat on and I can set up a nice little combat patrol or kill team game in the living room. So I'm quite happy with how it turned out in the end and it was pretty cheap. So thinking about the expenses, the most expensive part was the electric legs. They're about $189 Australian from Amazon. And then the rest of it all up was probably well under $500. So I just had the cheap utility board rather than having a solid piece of wood. These pieces of wood that are like lots of little strips of wood that are all glued together. They're a lot cheaper and they still do the same job. Once you varnish it up, it looks nice. I had some strips of wood for the raised edges. and the little brackets. I think they're about $25 each to make the bottom shelf, and the little clamps that I use to attach the sideboard, they're only a few bucks each. It's probably about $20 or $30 worth of screws, and I think everything else I sort of had all ready. Now, if you're doing it yourself, you may not have a jigsaw and a sander. You can use hand tools for those, but if you do a lot of hobby stuff, you've probably got those things anyway. So yeah, it was a really fun project, and I think I can be pretty proud of what I did, considering that I didn't really have a lot of woodworking experience before. It's not perfect, but looking at the original requirements to have a raisable table for combat patrol, hit those, and also made a few enhancements along the way. So had the casters so I could move it around, had the shelf, and had the edges, and had the sideboard. So I think the next part is trying to make it work for the larger games of Warhammer. So the easiest thing to do there would be to just make another table. I have some space in my hobby room here where I could put the table and just store stuff on it, so it's not taking up a lot of room in the living room, and then just wheel it out, because we've got wheels on these when I do want to play a larger game in the living room. Other ideas I've had is try to do sort of like a drop leaf type configuration where I would need some telescoping legs or something like that to secure it, because the original legs, they're not really big enough and supportive enough to fit a full-sized board on there without being very wobbly. So I'd need to think about that a little bit more before I go on to the next stage. But yeah, I really like doing these little side projects in between painting and converting Warhammer, and I'd encourage you to give it a go if you want to expand your skills and just try something new. So hope you enjoyed, and get out there and do some hobby.